A 90-year-old company died in about 8 months, not because of what it did wrong, because of what it did after. Arthur Andersen was one of the 5 biggest accounting firms on the planet. Decades of trust, built office by office, client by client, going back to 1913. It audited Enron's books, and when Enron's fraud started unraveling in 2001, employees inside Andersen's Houston office shredded thousands of documents connected to that audit. Prosecutors didn't charge the individuals who did the shredding. They charged the entire firm with obstruction of justice. Clients do not wait around during a criminal indictment. Within weeks, companies across the globe fired Andersen as their auditor, not because those companies' own books were touched by any of this, but because being associated with a firm under criminal indictment carried its own risk they weren't willing to hold. Regulators pulled Andersen's license to certify public company audits, which is the entire product an accounting firm sells. By the end of 2002, a firm with 85,000 employees worldwide had collapsed to almost nothing. Here's the detail that makes this story sting even more. In 2005, the Supreme Court overturned the conviction on a technicality in how the jury had been instructed. Legally, Arthur Andersen was in the clear. It didn't matter. The firm was already gone. There was no client base left to rebuild, no 85,000 employees waiting to come back to work. A legal win arrived years after the actual death of the company. Now, let's slow down and actually look at what killed it. Because the popular version of this story, that Andersen got caught up in Enron's fraud, misses the real mechanism entirely. Andersen did not go under because its auditors missed the fraud, though they did. It went under because of what one office did in the days after the fraud started coming apart. That is a completely different failure, and it's the one that applies to your organization, whether you work in accounting or not. Think about this from 3 different angles, because each one explains a piece of why the collapse happened so fast and so completely. Start with individual psychology, the level of the person who actually picked up the shredder. In the moment, destroying documents rarely feels like committing a career-ending crime. It usually feels like buying time, like making a mess slightly smaller before someone more senior deals with it properly. Nobody in that room was thinking, "I am about to end a 90-year-old company." They were thinking about the next few hours, not the next few months. This is worth sitting with, because it means the danger isn't limited to people who are corrupt. It's available to anyone under enough pressure who hasn't been given a clear rule for exactly this situation in advance. Now look at team dynamics, the level of how a local decision escalates without anyone at headquarters ever approving it or even knowing about it until it's already done. Andersen's leadership in Chicago did not order the shredding in Houston. By the time anyone senior found out, the decision had already been made, already been acted on, and already been discovered by investigators. A company with 85,000 employees was judged, in the eyes of clients and regulators, by the actions of a relatively small group of people in one office, acting without central approval. This is the part most managers underestimate. You do not need a company-wide policy of misconduct for the company's reputation to take a company-wide hit. You need exactly one team, in exactly one bad moment, with exactly no clear instructions for what to do when something goes wrong. And finally, look at the organizational incentive structure, the level of what an accounting firm is actually selling. Andersen's entire business model rested on one asset, the belief that its audits could be trusted. Not office buildings, not equipment, not even its client list directly. Trust was the entire inventory. Once regulators and clients believed that trust could not be verified, there was nothing else underneath it to fall back on. Most companies aren't purely trust-based businesses the way an auditor is, but every company has some version of this. A hospital sells the belief that its diagnoses are accurate. A bank sells the belief that its numbers are honest. A software company sells the belief that its uptime claims are real. Somewhere in your organization, there is a version of Andersen's trust asset, and it is more exposed than the balance sheet suggests. Now picture a version of this same mechanism playing out on a much smaller, much more ordinary scale. Imagine a mid-sized company with several regional offices. One regional office discovers a data security issue affecting customer records. Instead of escalating it immediately, someone in that office decides to quietly patch the problem and say nothing, reasoning that it's technically fixed now and disclosure would just create unnecessary panic. Weeks later, the quiet patch gets discovered anyway, not the underlying issue, the decision to hide it. Suddenly, customers in every other region, offices that had nothing to do with the original problem, start asking whether their own data has ever been mishandled without them being told. The other regional teams did nothing wrong. They still inherit the damage because from the outside, the company doesn't have 5 separate reputations. It has one. But here's the part managers most often miss when they hear this story, and it's the part worth genuinely sitting with. The speed gap is the real lesson, not the misconduct itself. Andersen spent decades earning the trust that let it operate as one of the 5 biggest firms on the planet. It lost every bit of that trust in a matter of months. Trust is slow to build and fast to lose, and the ratio between those two speeds is not close to even. Most managers plan as though reputation erodes gradually, giving them time to course correct. Andersen's collapse shows the opposite curve, a long, flat line of accumulated trust, followed by a cliff. There's a nuance here worth being precise about, because it's easy to draw the wrong lesson from this story. The mistake wasn't that Andersen investigated something internally, or that it was cautious about what it disclosed, while facts were still unclear. Careful internal review during a live problem is not the same thing as destroying the evidence connected to that review. Some managers, hearing this story, overcorrect in the opposite direction, announcing every internal problem publicly the moment it surfaces, before anyone actually knows what happened. That instinct is also a mistake, just a quieter one. It trades accuracy for the appearance of transparency, and can do damage of its own if the initial facts turn out to be wrong. The actual lesson sits between those two extremes. Investigate carefully, but preserve everything, and never let the appearance of concealment become part of the story, even accidentally. It's worth pausing on why the shredding happened in the first place, because the explanation isn't as simple as someone panicked. Accounting firms operate under document retention policies that allow routine destruction of old files as a normal part of business, the kind of housekeeping every large organization does, constantly without anyone thinking twice. Investigators later argued that the shredding at Andersen's Houston office accelerated sharply once the SEC investigation into Enron became public, which is exactly what turned an otherwise unremarkable, routine process into the central act of the entire prosecution. The line between ordinary document management and obstruction of justice, in this case, was almost entirely about timing. The same physical action, feeding paper into a shredder, meant something completely different depending on whether it happened before or after regulators started asking questions. That's a detail worth sitting with, because it means the danger for any manager isn't limited to dramatic, obviously criminal behavior. It's hiding inside ordinary routines that suddenly carry different weight the moment scrutiny arrives. And most people never stop to ask whether today is one of those moments. There's also a financial angle to this collapse that gets glossed over in the shorter version of the story, and it matters for understanding just how fast the death spiral moved. Auditing firms don't hold large reserves of cash the way a manufacturer holds inventory. Their primary asset, beyond trust, is a workforce of highly employable professionals, accountants who can walk across the street to a competing firm the moment their current employer looks unstable. As soon as clients started leaving and the indictment became public, Andersen's own staff began leaving too, not because they were disloyal, but because staying attached to a firm under criminal investigation was a career risk they weren't willing to absorb personally. That created a second collapse layered on top of the first. Client departures triggered staff departures, and staff departures made it even harder to serve the clients who were still considering staying, which triggered more departures. The mechanism fed itself. This is the part that separates a bad quarter from an extinction event. Once trust becomes the entire product, and both your customers and your own workforce lose it simultaneously, there is no slower, more forgiving version of the collapse available. It just runs to completion. Compare this to a scenario where a company handles a very similar mistake completely differently, because the contrast makes the actual lesson sharper. Imagine a different regional office discovering the exact same kind of serious problem. a compliance failure that genuinely happened and genuinely needs to be dealt with. Instead of quietly managing it internally, that office immediately escalates to legal and leadership the same day, preserves every relevant document without being asked, and cooperates fully the moment investigators or auditors request information. The underlying mistake in that scenario might be just as serious as Andersen's original audit failures. But the company's response becomes the story regulators and clients actually judge, and a fast, transparent, well-documented response tends to be treated as evidence of a healthy organization that made one mistake, not a corrupt one that needs to be shut down entirely. The mistake itself is rarely the deciding factor in how these situations end. The response almost always is. So what does a manager actually do with this? Before a crisis ever shows up, build the protocol now, not during the emergency. Decide, in calm conditions, exactly what happens the moment any part of your organization is notified of an investigation, a serious complaint, or a security incident. What gets preserved, who gets told immediately, and who has the authority to decide what's disclosed and when. If that protocol only gets written after the crisis starts, it gets written by whoever happens to be in the room that day, under pressure, exactly like Houston in 2001. If a manager ever hears that any part of their organization is destroying records or hiding information during a live investigation, that cannot be treated as a legal question to defer to someone else later. It has to be an immediate stop-everything moment, handled the day it's heard, not the week it's heard. There's also a longer-term angle worth considering about how this single event reshaped an entire industry rather than just ending one firm. Before Andersen's collapse, the accounting profession operated with what's often called the Big Five, five dominant global firms handling the overwhelming majority of large public company audits. After Andersen disappeared, it became the Big Four, and it has stayed the Big Four ever since, more than 2 decades later. No new firm rose to replace the missing fifth seat at that scale, because building the kind of institutional trust required to audit the world's largest companies takes decades, not years, and no competitor was willing to make that bet from scratch. One firm's failure to handle a crisis correctly permanently reduced the number of major players in an entire global industry. That's a scale of consequence most managers never consider when they're making a fast decision under pressure about what to do with a problem that just landed on their desk. The decision rarely feels historic in the moment. It only becomes historic in hindsight once the dust settles and the damage has already fully played out. One more angle worth sitting with is how this same failure pattern shows up at a scale far smaller than a Fortune 500 accounting firm, because most managers reading this will never run a company with 85,000 employees, but nearly every manager eventually runs a team going through some version of a crisis. Even a team of 8 people has its own version of trust as an invisible, load-bearing asset, whether that's a client's trust that deadlines will be honestly communicated, or a leadership team's trust that bad news gets reported quickly rather than smoothed over until it's unavoidable. The Andersen story scales down cleanly because the mechanism isn't really about firm size at all. It's about the gap between what actually happened and what people were told happened. And that gap does the same kind of damage whether it involves 85,000 employees or 8. It's also worth naming what this means for managers who don't sit anywhere near the top of an organization, because it's tempting to hear a story about a firm-wide collapse and assume the lesson only applies to executives making company-wide decisions. It doesn't. The actual decision that triggered Andersen's collapse was made by people well below the executive level, in a single regional office, without headquarters ever weighing in until it was too late to matter. That means the protocol this story demands isn't just a policy document sitting in a compliance manual that senior leadership signs off on once a year. It has to be something every manager, at every level, genuinely understands and would actually apply in the moment, because the moment when it matters most is rarely going to arrive with a headquarters representative standing in the room to make the right call for you. There's one final piece worth naming about the gap between legal outcome and reputational outcome, because these two things are judged on completely different clocks. The Supreme Court's 2005 reversal operated on a legal clock, years long, careful, deliberate, built for accuracy over speed. The market's judgment of Andersen operated on a reputational clock, weeks long, built for speed over accuracy, reacting to headlines and client fear rather than waiting for a final verdict. Any manager handling a crisis needs to understand that these two clocks are running simultaneously and will not finish at the same time. Waiting for the slow, accurate clock to vindicate you before acting on the fast, reputational one is a losing strategy, because by the time the accurate verdict arrives, the reputational damage has usually already run to completion, exactly like it did here. There's one more comparison worth making between Arthur Andersen and firms that survived their own scandals in the same era. Some accounting and consulting firms weathered serious client failures and regulatory scrutiny without collapsing because they had already built a culture where a junior employee flagging a risky client relationship was treated as protecting the firm, not slowing it down. Arthur Andersen's culture ran the opposite direction for years before the Enron collapse, prioritizing client retention and partner revenue targets over the kind of internal pushback that catches a bad call early. The shredding decision didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of an environment that had already trained its people, gradually, to treat client relationships as more fragile than the firm's own integrity. Has your team ever had a small local decision blow up into something the whole department got blamed for? Tell me what happened in the comments. I want to hear how it actually played out on the ground.